And today we have a special lecture. There's a few people still coming, so before we introduce Professor Morris, I just wanted to say that next week we have some good lectures here in this hall. You have a sheet in the material that's in front of you. And on Monday we have Dan Fuluni, who will be speaking about the boycott movement and developing a scholarly, intellectual response to the BDS movement. And Dan had an article in the Allgemeiner. Joshua Levitt, the author of the article, is here. And it really touched the nerve. And Dan is actually joining the forces with ISGAP, and we're going to elaborate about this on Monday. So we're trying to create a group of scholars to deal with the BDS movement and to deal with it in a way at an academic, intellectual level, but also on I guess on a professional level, because many scholars, even in New York City, find it very difficult to speak out clearly about their affiliation or affinity to Israel, because they feel that their careers, their progress in their careers will be jeopardized. So Dan has touched the nerve, and they're starting a group of scholars from around New York that will come and participate on almost like perhaps like the feminist movement in the 60s and 70s to try and deal with issues of consciousness and that sort of thing. So Dan is here, and he'll be speaking on Monday. He's the gentleman in the back near the door. Benny Weinthal, who is a fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy and also a journalist for the Jerusalem Post and other leading publications internationally. Will be speaking on Wednesday, March the 26th. It's not on the schedule. Benny is here. He's based in Berlin. He's the gentleman here at the center of the table. And he'll be speaking next week, so it's an honor to have these two scholars and intellectuals join us at the ISGAP events. And I'd also like to acknowledge the director of the AJC, David Harris, just walked into the room. It's nice that you've joined us. Welcome. And today we have the distinct honor to welcome back to ISGAP, a friend of ISGAP in our work, Professor Benny Morris. Benny Morris is currently a professor of history in the Middle East Studies in the Department of Middle East and History at Gurion University. He's been a leading figure and was a leading figure in the so-called New Historians. For over two decades ago, helped to reshape the understanding of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And he actually coined the term the New Historians to describe himself and others. Professor Morris graduated from Cambridge University with a PhD in modern European history and returned to Israel to work as a scholar, but also as a correspondent for the Jerusalem Post with our friend Mr. Weinthal. And he worked with the Jerusalem Post for 12 years. And in the 1980s began reading through Israeli government archives, and he turned his attention to the origins of the Palestinian refugee problem, which created all sorts of waves politically and academically. And he's also gone on to write very important books, including Righteous Victims, A History of the Zionist Arab Conflict, the Israeli Border Wars, and the Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited. And he also wrote the book 1948, The First Arab-Israeli War. And as a fellow scholar, and welcome Benny back as a friend to ISGAP, it's really an honor for us because he's a scholar that has always stood brave and pursued truth through his research, and he continues to do so to this day. So it's really an honor to have
you. Charles, thanks. I was asked to talk about one aspect or one way of looking at the 1948 war, the first Arab-Israeli war, which I think is the most important among the Israeli-Arab wars, and in some ways, unfortunately, it's the issues opened up by that war have been reopened and are currently with us at a political level. I'm going to talk about 1948 as a jihad, as a holy war. in January 1948, a few weeks after the United Nations passed the partition resolution, and a few weeks after the Palestinian Arab militias began their assault on the emergent state of Israel, a woman called Matiel Muranam was interviewed in Jerusalem. Matiel Muranam was a Lebanese Christian woman who had married a Jerusalem Muslim, had moved to Jerusalem, and headed the Arab Women's Organization, which was an affiliate of the Arab Higher Committee. The Arab Higher Committee was the executive body of the Palestinian Arab National Movement, the body led by Haj Amin al-Husseini, which drew the Arabs of Palestine into their revolt against the British in 1936-39, and led the Arabs of Palestine into the war against the Zionists in 1947-48. So she was the head of their women's section, if you like. And she was interviewed in January 1948, a few weeks after the start of hostilities. And this is what she said to her interviewer. The UN partition decision has united all Arabs as they have never been united before, not even against the Crusaders. A Jewish state has no chance to survive now that the Holy War has been declared. All the Jews will eventually be massacred. A Christian woman from Lebanon would move to Palestine. A few weeks later, midway in the war, by which time the Palestinian Arab militias and Palestinian society in general had been defeated, and the Arab states had invaded Palestine, and some of them had attacked Israel in May 1948. In August 1948, one of the members of the Arab Higher Committee, Emil Ruri, responded to an article in the Daily Telegraph in London, basically saying that the solution to the Palestinian refugee problem, which had begun to evolve in the course of the war, did not lay by way of repatriation. You couldn't repatriate the Arabs of Palestine back into the Jewish state. The Jews would, as he put it, would hold them hostage and torture them severely. What he said was that a return of the Palestinian refugees would only occur with the annihilation or elimination of Israel. As he put it, we must inculcate in the heart of every Arab hatred for the Jews, and we must then renew the Jihad against Israel. The refugees would return to their places after Palestine was reconquered. I gave you these two examples of the jihadist perception on the Arab side of the war. Historians of 1948 have tended over the decades to see the 1948 war as a nationalist war between two national movements, two collectives, two peoples who were fighting over a piece of territory, much like national wars between European states had been fought over the centuries. There was, of course, a difference when France and Germany were fighting over, say, in the 19th, 20th centuries. They were fighting usually about borderlands, that is, the marchlands, the peripheries of each state, Alsace-Lorraine, who would occupy, who would control those territories. In the case of the Palestinian Zionist conflict, we're talking about a fight over the whole of the territory. It's an unusual national conflict in which each side claims the whole of the territory. This certainly was also the Zionist position until 1937, and certainly was the Arab position in the course of 1948. They wanted all of Palestine. But I would say that the War of 1948, and this is a result of my research over the past few years, which produced the book 1948, sort of a general history of the war. My research, at least in my reading, uncovered quite a lot of material indicating that the war from the Arab side, from the Palestinian side, and then thereafter from the Arab state side, was also a jihad. It wasn't a simple political war over territory. It was a war of religion and culture as well. I'm saying from the Arab side because the Zionist side in 1948 was essentially a secular society. The Zionist enterprise in Palestine was essentially a secular movement. It was led by people who were essentially atheists or agnostics who had in effect rejected religion as part and package of the diaspora which they had turned their backs on and fled from, and moved to Palestine to establish a new society and a state which would be secular. The demography of Palestine at the time in terms of the Jewish community was certainly 90+% secular and less than 10% religious. 10% would be a high figure probably for the number of people who would define themselves as religious in Palestine at that time. And not only were they very small in number, but they were insignificant in terms of influence. They didn't control any of the organs, pre-state organs or the new state organs after May 1948. So essentially from the Zionist side, the war wasn't being fought and wasn't conceived at all as a holy war, a war dictated by religious conviction or religious truth or religious purpose. The Arab society was different. Now, there are several methodological problems with looking at the war as also a jihad. I'm not saying it wasn't also a political war, I'm saying it was also a jihad, and perhaps prominently in many people's minds, primarily a jihad, but that's not clear. There are methodological problems in this. The first of them arises, in other words, to pin down the nature of the war in terms of the people who are fighting it on the Arab side. One of them is very simple, and that is that the Arab archives were all closed. The Palestinians produced no real archives, and the Arab states may have produced archives, but we don't know if they did because they're not open. So there may be lots of good documents in the Egyptian, Jordanian, Syrian archives and so on, but they're unavailable, inaccessible to all historians, not just Jews, not just Americans, but also Arabs. They're closed, as is the nature of dictatorships. You do not open their archives. That's one problem. The second problem is how do you define a war as jihad? What do you need to be able to say, for an historian to be able to say, this was a jihad? Does it take the political leaders who go to war, they have to state, they believe and then state that they're going to jihad? Is that necessary? Will that help us to reach such a definition? Or is it the religious establishment in each country which defines the war as such, and then we can conclude or accept this definition as a truthful about the war? Is it the population which has to basically accept this as the nature of the war and define it as such? And here we have a problem again because of the lack of democracy in the Arab states and the illiteracy of the Arab masses. We're talking about societies with over 90% illiteracy, no public opinion surveys, no free expression of opinion, no recording of opinion by the masses, both the civilians and the soldiery. How do we know what they were thinking in terms of the war they were actually engaged in? Did they see it as jihad? We have almost no evidence of this. So these are methodological problems. There's another methodological problem which arises in terms of this definition of the war, and that is that societies in which there is no separation of church and state, such as Arab societies during 1948, and to a great degree also in decades later, the discourse of leaders is often couched in religious terms, whether or not they're they have deep religious convictions. In other words, Farouk the king of Egypt at the time may have talked in terms of we're embarking on a jihad, but was this heartfelt? Was this sincere? Was he really expressing what he felt, or was he just pandering to the religious bureaucracies or hoping to use this catchphrase, jihad, or things to do with religious sites to mobilize the masses, because that would speak to them. You talk about religion, the masses understand what you're talking about. You talk about nationalism, sovereignty, perhaps that wouldn't have spoken to them, and it wouldn't have helped to mobilize them. So the problem of discourse here is important. I'll just point to something more modern, just to highlight the problem. When Sadat, the president of Egypt, went to speak in the Knesset in 1977, he opened his speech in the Knesset with the phrase, in the name of Allah, the merciful, the righteous, whatever. This didn't necessarily mean that he felt this. Maybe he was actually a religious man, but this is something that, this is the normal discourse of Arab leaders. It doesn't mean that they're giving a religious message or trying to persuade people of something in the realm of religion. It's just the way they speak. So how do you know when the religious leaders in 48 are speaking in with these terms, in this sort of phraseology? Does this really mean they're embarked in jihad, or are they just saying it because that's the nature of the discourse in their societies at the time? So these are methodological problems when approaching this question of the definition of the war as jihad, which is these are problems worth bearing in mind. The history of the Islamic world is replete with holy wars against the infidel. I would say that there were 4 waves of jihad in the course of the history of the contact between the Muslim world and the West, if you like, or the Christian world. The first wave, of course, is with the rise of Islam. In the 7th century AD, the Muslim masses, the newly converted Muslim soldiery, push out of Arabia, conquer the Middle East, North Africa, enter Spain, and so on. And this is the first wave of jihad, and of course it's an aggressive jihad. It's a war against the infidel to conquer the territory of the infidel and ultimately to convert, push out, kill, or convert the populace to this new religion. The second wave of jihad, I would say, is in the Middle Ages, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, and that's the defensive jihad by the Muslim armies and masses against the incursion by Westerners, Christians, into Islamic lands, and that's against the Crusaders. That is the war against the Crusaders, who would occupy Palestine and regions beyond, set up their kingdoms in the Middle East, in the Levant, and the Arabs eventually drove them out in waves of jihad, or if you like, one large wave of jihad over the 12th, 13th centuries. The third wave, which was an aggressive wave of jihad against the West, was of course the 15th to 17th centuries, the Turkish eruption, the Ottoman eruption out of Turkey northwards into the Balkans, to the gates of Budapest and Vienna, when they tried to conquer Central Europe, southern and Central Europe. Basically they returned back, but they held on to much of the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire, for centuries afterwards. And today I think we're in the throes of the 4th wave of jihad, in which the Muslims describe it as defensive, attempting to turn back Western penetration, which is cultural, economic, military in the case of America in Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. But it's this jihad, which has been described as a civilizational war or a clash of civilizations, certainly it is seen as such by many Muslims, perhaps by the Muslim world in general. It stretches from the Philippines, where there are Muslim rebellion, there is a Muslim rebellion, through much of the Middle East, in Nigeria, the streets of the suburbs of Paris, in New York, as we know, etc. This is the 4th wave of jihad, and as I say, many Muslims present it and describe it as defensive. They're trying to push back, to resist the West's incursion into their lands. Palestine, the Zionist-Palestinian or Arab conflict can be seen within this context of this fourth wave of jihad, in my view. Israel, Zionist entity in Israel, which were defined by the Zionists themselves from Herzl onwards as an outpost of the West in a barbaric area, if you like, a villa in the jungle or a villa in the desert. And so the Arabs also saw this as an incursion of Europeans into their domain, even a colonial incursion, as it's often defined by Arabs. And this is a major battlefront in this fourth wave of global jihad, in my view. Unfortunately, I would say also, from the Israeli point of view. One can include in this, incidentally, which is something I'm researching at the moment, one can include in this also the Turkish elimination of the Christian minorities in Turkey in the course before World War I, during World War I, after World War I, primarily the Armenians and Greeks. This can be also seen within this context of a resurgent Islam combating the infidel Christian world. There is an argument among Muslim theologians, there was an argument among Muslim theologians after the 7th, 8th centuries over the definition of jihad when they were talking about war against the infidel, and the argument revolved around, much of it revolved around the question of defensiveness. Defensive jihad was, of course, always seen as legitimate, but whether jihad could also be waged aggressively, not in terms of defending your lands or your culture, but in terms of expansion of the Islamic domain. But in general, the Quran, a summoning of jihad, of the Muslims to jihad, is embedded in a particular sentence in the Quran, which says, which calls on the believers to wage holy war against the infidel. It says in that sentence, and this is what it's all based on, if you like, fight those who do not believe in Allah or in Judgment Day, and who do not accept the true religion, even if they be the peoples of the book, meaning Jews or Christians, until they pay the jizya in submission and feel themselves submissive. In other words, you must wage jihad against the infidel until he submits, essentially, until he is conquered. That's what the theory, the theology of jihad is based on. The idea of jihad against the Zionist enterprise predates the 1947-48 war. In March 1936, I'll just give you several examples. In March 1936, the Speaker of the Iraqi Parliament, Iraq was already by then an independent state, a man called Said al-Hajj Tabith, he visited Palestine and called for jihad against the Zionists during his visit. A decade before, the Mufti of Gaza had issued a fatwa, a religious ruling, against land sales to Jews, arguing that the Jews were no longer wards of Islam, were no longer legitimate wards of Islam. They shouldn't be defended by Islam, and because they were apostates and infidels, and ruled against any contact, essentially, with Jews, meaning the Zionists in Palestine. During the Arab revolt of 1936-39 against the British, but also against the Zionist enterprise in Palestine, the discourse of the rebels was studied with a jihadi phraseology, and was seen by the rebels themselves and by the British also as a religious struggle, a religious revolt, not just a revolt to move out from under a colonial regime, to liberate themselves from a colonial regime, but also as a religious struggle against infidels who were in charge. the Arab Higher Committee, which led that revolt in Palestine, included the following typical sentence in its statement at the start of the revolt. Because of the general feeling of danger that envelops this noble nation, there is a need for solidarity and unity and a focus on strengthening the holy national jihad movement. This is how they defined the rebellion. Preachers in the Nablus area, religious preachers, were prominent among those who were mobilizing the masses, the militias, for combat. In 1947, in November, the United Nations passed the Partition Resolution. The response was by the Arabs of Palestine and by the Arab states surrounding Palestine was, of course, rejection of the Partition Resolution, which called for the establishment of two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state in a partitioned Palestine. They rejected it. And the day following the resolution, on the 30th of November, the Palestinian militias, in very disorganized fashion, began to shoot, and thus opened the snowballing civil war, which was the first part of the 1948 war, the civil war between the two communities in Palestine, which, as I say, was followed in May 1948 by the pan-Arab invasion of the newly founded State of Israel. On the 2nd of December 1947, and this is the crucial date, and I think the crucial event, if you want, in the definition of what happened subsequently as a jihad, as a religious war on the Arab side, on the 2nd of December 1947, 3-4 days after the UN passed the Partition Resolution, the ulama, the Council of Theologians of Al-Azhar University in Cairo, which is the most prominent, the predominant religious body which issues religious rulings, fatwas, in the Sunni Arab world, which is the majority part of Islam in the Arab world. There's Shia and the Sunni. The Sunnis are the majority in the Arab world, and the ulama of Al-Azhar, the council of wise men, headed by the rector of Al-Azhar, those are, if you like, the pope of the Sunni Arab world. There are a few other centers of religious ruling, the Sheikh of Mecca and so on, but the most important, as accepted over the past 1400 years or so, is the, or since the founding of the university in the 10th century, is the ulama of Al-Azhar. On the 2nd of December 1947, they issued a fatwa which called on the Arabs, the Muslim world, all Muslims, to join a jihad in defense of Arab Palestine. The liberation of Palestine is a religious duty, as they put it, for all Muslims without exception, great and small. The Islamic and Arab governments should without delay take effective and radical measures, military or otherwise. This pronouncement by the ulama was repeated, of Al-Azhar, was repeated in April 1948, just before the pan-Arab invasion, perhaps in part as pressure vis-a-vis the Egyptian government and the other Arab governments to actually carry out this invasion, because they weren't that certain of what they were going to do in April. They only decided at the last moment, the Egyptians, to actually invade. The ulama of Al-Azhar issued in April a second fatwa reiterating the first one, and indeed they issued it again in December 1948, which was a time by which the Egyptian army had more or less been defeated by the Israelis. In other words, even in defeat, they simply said, we must continue this jihad, another round, that's essentially what they were saying. We must continue with it until the Zionist entity is crushed. The rector of Al-Azhar on the 15th of May declared the hour of jihad has struck, 15th of May being the date of the pan-Arab invasion, including the Egyptian army's invasion of Palestine. The hour of jihad has struck. 100 of you will defeat 1,000 of the infidels. This is the hour in which Allah promised paradise. And the ulama of Al-Azhar also spoke to the various reluctant Arab leaders, certainly by the end of the war, and they condemned to damnation any Arab leader who did not participate in the jihad. They were thinking especially of Abdullah, who was more or less backtracking and moving away from warfare by the last months of 1948. The jihadism of 1948 is accompanied by a strong dose of anti-Semitism. The Prime Minister of Jordan in 1947, Samir Rifai, was interviewed by a number of Western journalists, two Western journalists, British journalists who came to him. And he told them in autumn, just before the start of the war, autumn 47, he told them, the Jews are a people to be feared. Give them another 25 years and they will be all over the Middle East, in our country and Syria and Lebanon, in Iraq and Egypt. This is the Prime Minister of Jordan, Samir Rifai. They were responsible for starting the 2 world wars, he told the journalists. Yes, I have read and studied, and I know they were behind Hitler at the beginning of his movement. Ibn Saud, in correspondence, Ibn Saud, who was the king of Saudi Arabia and the keeper of the most holy sites of Islam, in correspondence with FDR, with Roosevelt, in 1943, reiterated more or less the same points, basically saying the Jews are the historic enemies of Muslims and carry the greatest hatred for the nation of Muhammad, and we cannot deal with them in any way. During 47 and 48, as the war was impending and once the war was already underway, a number of senior Arab politicians harked back to the Crusades, to the Islamic struggle and success in the struggle against the European Christian invaders of Palestine 800 years before. Abdul Rahman Azam was the Secretary General of the Arab League and more or less the spokesman for the Arab cause in 1948. If they had one unified spokesman, that would be the man. He wrote, "You the Jews," he didn't write, he said it to 2 Jews he met secretly, Abba Eban and another man called David Horowitz, who later became the head of the Bank of Israel. Abba Eban, of course, became the foreign minister of Israel. But in 1947, they both worked for the Jewish Agency, and they met him secretly, Abdul Rahman Azam, and he told them, "You, the Jews, are a temporary phenomenon. Centuries ago, the Crusaders established themselves in our midst against our will, and in 200 years, we ejected them." Meaning that even if we don't succeed in this current struggle in 1948, your fate is going to be similar to the Crusaders. Shukri al-Kawakli, the president of Syria, the following year, during the war itself in 48, came out with similar statements about the Pan-Arab invasion. Overcoming the Crusaders took a long time, but the result was victory. There's no doubt that history is repeating itself. President of Syria in 1948. Riyad al-Sulh, the Prime Minister of Lebanon, said similar things also in 1948. So it was no surprise that if you like, the most prominent of the Arab leaders, or at least the leader of the most important of the Arab states, which was Egypt, King Farouk of Egypt, and his foreign minister, a man called Khashaba, in the summer of 42, after the invasion in May 48, said that, and they told this to Western diplomats, for the whole Arab world, the struggle is a matter of religion. For them, for the Arabs in the Arab world, for them it's a matter of Jewish religion against their own religion. According to Farouk, the Arab masses were gripped by widespread religious fervor, and men were keen to enter the fray as the shortest road to heaven. Even the king of Jordan, Abdullah, in 48, found occasion to speak of the war itself in religious terms. On 14 May, as his army was assembling just east of the River Jordan, about to cross the river westward into Palestine, he spoke to his troops, to the Arab Legion, in the following terms. And Abdallah was the most moderate of the Arab leaders at the time. He'd been negotiating with the Zionists before 48, and he was to negotiate with the Zionists at the cost of his life, in fact. After 48, he was assassinated by a Palestinian in 1951, partly because of his secret negotiations with the Israelis. But on May 14th, he too was at least adopted the discourse of holy war, if he didn't actually believe in it himself, when he said to, as I say, his troops who had massed, assembled across the Jordan, he who will be killed will be a martyr, a shaheed. He who lives will be glad of fighting for Palestine. I remind you of the jihad and of the martyrdom of your great-grandfathers. I'm not sure who he was referring to, but in terms of the grandparents, but that was his speech at the time. Let me conclude these remarks by saying, and this isn't usually done by academics, but how tentative my conclusions are. What I'm saying is that from the evidence I saw, there are good grounds for regarding the war as a jihad from the Arab perspective in 1948. I've given you a little of some of the evidence. What really is necessary, and that I didn't do, I was researching the war itself, not various cultural aspects of the war, if you like. What is necessary, probably, if somebody wants to look in greater depth at this question of was it perceived as jihad, and was it jihad? Was it perceived by the Arab masses and leaders and religious establishments, and was it actually jihad? More systematic research needs to be done. There is the problem of closed Arab archives, but on the other hand, there is access to newspapers. There were newspapers in Morocco, in Tunis, in Syria, in Iraq. Some of them probably reported on sermons delivered at major mosques. This work needs to be done, a lot of legwork, to deepen our understanding of the jihadi nature of the 48 war from the Arab perspective. But my feeling is that the surface which I've scraped in terms of the evidence which I encountered gives us a good lead about the nature of the war in Arab eyes. Question?
For question and answer.
Thanks. So Benny's happily agreed to take some questions and comments. Comments. Okay, so here, and we're going to pass around the microphone, so I'd be grateful if you could speak to the microphone.
Yes, yes.
Professor, in the course of your research, do you come across the concept of the inalienability of Islamic lands, and if so, how that may affect the war at the outset and may continue to be a factor to the present day?
I'm not sure it's something I've encountered in my research, because my research dealt with the past, or the 48 war, the 50s, and it was taken as obvious that the land should be restored to Islam. In the Hamas Charter, it says clearly from 1988 that lands which were once Islamic should revert to Islamic control ultimately. You do find occasionally, well, let me put it another way. In 1947, in that famous conversation, secret conversation between Abdul Rahman Azam, the Secretary General of the Arab League, and Abba Eban and David Gurwitz, the two Jewish agency representatives, Azam said something interesting from the historian's perspective. He said, well, we may have lost Andalus. In other words, we may have lost Spain, and maybe that's something we cannot recover because of the strength of the Christian world. It's not something which was once Islamic and now can be recovered, even though maybe Islam demands that we recover it. It's not realistic. But I don't think Palestine is in the same context it's not something we necessarily will lose, and even if we temporarily lose it, as I quoted, we will regain it after or within 200 years. The Prime Minister, incidentally, of the Palestine Authority, the first one, Abu Allah, also referred in one of his speeches, a very rare reference, but in one of his speeches to Andalus, to Spain, which needs, he didn't actually say it needs to be recovered, but he referred to it in the same breath as he referred to Palestine, in the same sentence, implying that that's also something which is a wholly Islamic property and must end up in Muslim hands.
So there's Chuck Freelock from the Kennedy School at Harvard and Tel Aviv University and the IGC, and a friend of ISGAP.
First of all, thanks. Can you hear? Is it on?
No. It's on. It's on.
It's on to the.
It's for recording.
Thanks for the historical overview, which I found very interesting because I think most of us tend to have looked at the early decades as being a national conflict and only becoming a more religious-based one after the Iranian Revolution and the rise of Hezbollah in '83 and Hamas subsequently. But the question is, what are the ramifications of emphasizing and recognizing the jihadi aspect of the conflict? One of them is obviously that if it's a religious conflict, it's infinitely harder to resolve than if it's a nationalist one. What are some of the other ramifications?
Well, I'm sure there are a lot, but as you suggest, the question is what are the ramifications if the conflict is actually a religious conflict, or more a religious conflict than a political conflict, with the implication that in some way it makes the conflict more severe or less soluble. Well, I think the Hezbollah is the answer. The Hezbollah, which is the Shiite militia and party, main political party in Lebanon, has proven to be a much more formidable foe to Israel than any previous guerrilla organization, and perhaps in some ways even more than Arab governments and their standing armies. People with deep religious convictions are willing to kill themselves and kill lots of other people as well, preferably lots of other people, but also themselves, tend to be, and especially if trained well, and the Hezbollah has been trained well over the decades by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, tend to be more resilient and more lethal enemies. And in that sense, if the war is, or the conflict is seen by the Arabs as a religious endeavor, this poses a greater problem for Israel. Let me say something about the Arab Spring, if I'm already talking about that. It appeared when the Arab revolts began in 2011 and spread across the Arab world, that they were headed for Islamization of the Arab world, that the immediate outcome of these rebellions would be a growing Islamic fervor in the Arab world, and perhaps the governments would turn Islamist. And they did in some places, even though this was stalled somewhat in Egypt, or maybe permanently, I don't know. And the fear was, or let me put it another way, that the tumult in the Arab world, in the short term, eased Israel's strategic position, because hitherto, before that, it had been worried about large standing Arab armies with large conventional armaments, the Syrian army, the Egyptian army, the Iraqi army, and so on. And these, after 2011, all in one way or other, either disintegrated or became otherwise engaged. The Egyptians suppressing internal insurgency, the Syrians fighting, God knows, basically against the Syrian people, or much of the Syrian people. The Iraqis engaged in their own civil wars. So this sort of reduced the burden on Israel militarily, and Israel, incidentally, cut back in its military strength over the past year. It demobilized about a certain number of armored brigades because it thought there's no longer a large conventional threat. The problem with this is that in the medium and long term, should the hand of the Islamists, should the Islamists gain control of much of the Middle East, and this seems to be in prospect in Syria, it might be in prospect in Jordan, in Egypt it's been thwarted temporarily at least, but should the Islamists gain control in the Middle East, we might return to a situation or a paradigm from the 12th and 13th centuries when Salah ad-Din, the Kurdish Muslim general, managed to unite the Arab world against the Christian infidel invaders and ultimately destroy the Crusader state. I'm not comparing Israel to the Crusader states, but the idea of unity in the Arab world forged through common religious conviction or fervor is something which Israel may face in the medium and long term as a result of this Arab Spring. So in answer to your question, it poses a real threat. Should this happen?
Hi, Benny. Open flunks also, and an admirer of yours and a coach over time, but I was rather disappointed, actually, by your statement that the conclusions here are so tentative.
Maybe I overstressed them.
I'm not sure why they're tentative. Well, there might be an explanation, and then you seem to ignore the figure except mentioned in Haji Husseini, who didn't just spend the war years in Berlin because he was running away from the British imperialists, but established tremendous affinity. They went both ways between people. Participated, was aware of the first among the Germans, was aware of the Holocaust. And there's a great, there's significant literature now on that factor. Jeffrey Herf's book, Arab Propaganda.
And there's a new one by Barry Rubin,
and the
which just
latest one
came
by
out.
Rubin. Prior to that, this guy Kunzel. So there's a huge amount of documentation showing that it was precisely the Islamist slant of Husseini that attracted, that Hitler found so, the Nazis found positive. There was a significant historical background to that, going all the way back to the First World War. But the fact is that the Palestinian national movement was led by Nazis.
Yeah.
And if they had succeeded even before that, there were preparations for another Holocaust in the Second World War if Rommel had won along the main. So what more do you need?
Now, I'm not sure the definition of Husseini as a Nazi is right. I think the definition of him as an anti-Semite is right. This was the common ground. It's not that Hitler was enamored with Islamism. Hitler liked a fellow anti-Semite to be in charge in the Arab world if that worked out, or at least as an ally in the Arab world. But I think the significant point about Husseini, in connection with what I was talking about, is that Husseini was a cleric. He was a Muslim cleric. And it's very unusual in the 20th century or the 19th and 20th centuries for a national movement to be led by a religious figure. The only one I can think of is Macarius of Cyprus. He was an archbishop who led the Cypriot Greeks. But clerics do not lead national movements in the modern world. And when they do, it shows us something different about those national movements. And in the case of the Palestinian Arabs, I think this was commensurate with or corresponded with the amount of Islamic undertone which governed or was present in that movement, in the Palestine Arab national movement. I think that's the point. Him being a cleric was symbolic and embodied this religious fervor, and he was able, of course, to mobilize the masses using exactly that, the religious argument, the Jewish threat to the Muslim sites, and so on. But if I want to be historically fair, and I would like to be, about the Husseini issue, I think he liked Hitler's anti-Semitism, found a common cause in it, but I think his primary drive when aligning with the Germans was that they were the enemies of the British and would help the Arabs to cast out the West from the Middle East, British imperialism, and allow him to have an independent Palestine governed by him. I think this was the major drive, but the anti-Semitism was there as well. That's how I would put it.
Concludes quite different.
No, the Herf book deals with the Herf book deals with broadcasts from Germany in Arabic, some of them by Husseini, to the Arab world, in which he calls for jihad and killing Jews. Obviously, this is what he wanted. But it doesn't mean that he wasn't impelled by his desire to get the British out of the Middle East.
Professor, I'm somewhat bemused by your presentation in terms of the definitional element of jihad. It is my understanding, and I think the common understanding, is religious war. General, okay? Now, in law, for example, I think Cardozo said, don't be bemused by the tyranny of labels. Now, whether you call it jihad or not, if you have a religious war, and particularly in the context of jihad, the animating element there, it's a defensive war in terms of, as you indicated, we've got to expel those who have invaded our territory, rightly or wrongly. Why defensive? Because that would be the war of annihilation. He who draws a sword against me, I better destroy him, etc., as opposed to my attacking him. What difference, why don't we accept their definition of I am engaged in a jihad, a war of extermination? How else would you define it? Give me your alternative. And the second question is, I have ordered your book, the revision, and I was wondering what basic ways has there been a revision of your original text? I'm waiting to get it. In other words, you're defining this as jihad. It's almost, to me, almost condescending in terms of whatever way you call it, wasn't it a jihad? They have considered it as such.
Yeah, no, I think I said that. I think from the Arab perspective, the struggle to this day, maybe even more deeply in the present days, is that the war has a large religious component and may even be essentially a religious cultural war. And in 48, it certainly obtruded. The religious element was very important in waging the war, as I said. I don't think that, I seem to hear from you that the Israelis and the Jews should also define the war as jihad from their side. And I don't think that's the case. Certainly wasn't the case in 48, and it still is not the case, even though Israeli society has become more religious. Demographically, more Israelis are of the religious.
What about the rest of the world? How would they define the 48 war? In other words, how would the United States, how would the EU define it? I think that's very important in the context of our current situation. It's not just we, it's the rest of the world.
But you have no argument with me. I wrote my book, 1948, in its conclusions, stresses that the war, as seen from the Arab side, was jihadi, and presumably the book is read by English-speaking people and will maybe come to see it that way as well. So there's no argument here between us. I do think that I know that the Obama regime and many Western regimes would prefer not to see, or prefer to believe that it's otherwise, that the struggle of Islam, or at least of Islamists against the West, is a religious struggle, but they prefer not to see that because they understand, as the speaker, one of the questioners suggested before, once the conflict turns religious, or if it's seen as religious, it's deeper, less soluble, and that makes it more problematic.
Well, the Hamas charter, for
example. Well, I didn't understand what you were saying. Yes, the Hamas charter is important in this context also, but I was speaking about 48. I didn't understand what you said about revision.
Yes.
You're talking about the book about the refugees? That's what you're talking about.
Yes.
Ah, well, okay, this is a subject I like to speak about, so yes, but I just want to add one sentence on this point. I published the original book on the birth of the refugee problem, the Palestinian refugee problem, 1947-48 to 1988. I published a second revised version, which is what you're referring to, in 2004. The second version is twice as long as the first version, but much better in my view. And the concluding chapter is almost exactly the same. In other words, I didn't revise my opinions at all. It's just much longer because the material was enriched by archives which had opened in the interim. Yeah.
Have you looked at, or will you look at, the thinking of Jews before 48 and in the struggle of 48 and how they conceived of the war, and did they have any realization at any point that in fact it was a religious struggle, and in fact they were struggling to survive against the religious onslaught against them. So I'm interested in that, this Jewish point of view, and if you take it to the modern period, your conception of 48 as jihad, how would the Israeli public view that today as a revelation, as something completely new, as a conceptualization that they hadn't considered?
Okay.
Where do we go with that?
The Zionist movement was a secular political movement. Its leaders were secular politicians like Gurion, Sharet, Weizmann. And when they looked at the struggle in the 20s and 30s and 40s, including 48, they looked at it as a political struggle between two national movements. They didn't often admit that there were two national movements. They always said, we're a national movement, they're a bunch of bums or whatever. Or whatever. They gave it all sorts of definitions. You know, the desert against civilization and so on. But they didn't see them as equal, or at least didn't publicly state that they were equal. But they, in their hearts, understood there's a contending, vying national movement against them. This made it difficult for them because they were secular nationalists and often socialists, and had rebelled against God and the godly world of the diaspora. They didn't actually understand that they were fighting a movement which was also religious. They didn't understand the non-separation of church and state on the other side. They didn't understand the non-modernity of the other side in the struggle. So people like Ben Gurion related to it as a simple political struggle. And we will never find almost any reference to jihad or religion as motivating the other side. They didn't see it. We today see it for various reasons. We're much more open, and we see things differently. We see things more and more comprehensively, but they didn't. As to revelation, that is my stating that there was a major jihadi aspect to the war, or the war can also be seen, in addition to being a political war, as a jihad, as a holy war from the Arab perspective, 1948. This is precisely the point over which my book was criticized by a large number of reviewers, Avi Schleim, Yoav Gelber, people from all sides of the political spectrum. They criticized this specific subject. They're saying it wasn't jihad, Benny has it wrong. So it's a new idea. That is what I've been telling you is not accepted, but wasn't accepted formally by historians, and currently is still in dispute. And maybe it'll be accepted, and maybe it won't. But it's as you said, a revelation in that sense, and is objected to, or is contrary to the common wisdom of historians about 1948.
Maybe we'll take two quick questions together.
I'll be very quick.
I can't hear.
You mentioned a series of fatwas, authoritative fatwas issued in the 1947-1948 period. Are they still in effect, and are they still meaningful if they're in effect?
Somebody asked me exactly that question yesterday in Miami, and I don't know. I don't know what happens to fatwas which are thrown into the trash can or not thrown into the trash can. Do they remain on the books forever? What I do know is that Sadat, when he made his peace with Israel in 1978-79, didn't ask Al-Azhar to revoke all previous fatwas, jihadi fatwas, etc., but he did insist that they not object to the current peace process and the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, which was signed in 79. So in effect, Al-Azhar's ulama endorsed the peace treaty, if not explicitly, at least implicitly by silence. And Sadat's regime was a dictatorship, and had the ulama or the various theologians publicly said no, they would have been thrown out of jobs or thrown into jail, which they understood. So that explains in part what happened. But what happened to the fatwas in terms of their legality and so on, the longevity, I don't know. I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable about the Muslim theology.
Ben, Larry Epsel, professor at Columbia University and our academic committee.
Firstly, thank you so much for a wonderful talk, and even more so for the careful scholarship that you bring to this. Really thank you for the care of your scholarship. One thing, just definitionally, when you say jihad, does that necessarily imply it's genocidal? Is that necessary? Are those equivalent, or how do they relate to each other?
No, the jihad, well, in praxis, what happened in the various waves of jihad, which I talked about, which the Arab Muslim world, Arab Muslim Turkish world unleashed in the various stages of history in the past 1400 years, it wasn't genocidal. Jihad, and as I quoted from the Quran, that specific key sentence, it doesn't have to be genocide. It requires submission. It requires that the other side concede defeat, and accept Muslim hegemony or mastery or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't necessarily, and usually it's followed by conversion rather than genocide. There were places where towns were put to the sword. Muhammad himself killed off the Jewish tribes in Arabia during his ascent, Islam's ascent at the very beginning. The Jews resisted and he killed them, or forcibly converted and enslaved the women and children. But it doesn't necessitate genocide, no, if that's what you're asking.
So to follow up very quickly, Benny, according to the Covenant for the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, passed by the UN, there's physical annihilation, which is a physical genocide, but there's also cultural genocide. So it sounds like you're referring to a form of genocide, if you will, as well, not physical death.
Okay.
There's a note, but you have to become part of the system. Okay. Question.
I'm old-fashioned in the way I look at the word genocide.
I'm surprised at the academic attitudes that we're taking to this question, because I think it's relevant to exactly what's going on today. So let me just recall a few things. When Yasser Arafat refused the offer that Israel gave him in 2000, one of the reasons given was that he would be assassinated if he did accept it.
He never said that. I don't remember him ever saying that.
No, others said that.
Maybe. Okay.
The offer that Ehud Olmert made to Abu Mazen was rejected. The rejection of Abu Mazen now to declare Israel as a Jewish state, if you do not believe that jihad is really what's driving this, then you are not understanding the problem in the Middle East. And if you think there is a possibility of ever making peace between the two, I think you have a dream.
I don't think I said anything at all on this subject. It's okay. I don't know if religious fervor or religious belief underlies Arafat's and Abbas's rejection of the peace offers made by Barack, Clinton, and Olmert, 2000, 2008. I don't know if it's religious conviction, but I think we're in agreement in terms of my belief that I don't think they are willing to accept a two-state solution. They don't want Israel's presence in the Middle East, whether it's driven by religious fervor or some religious fervor and mostly political thinking. They want a Palestine for themselves, for their own political self-determination. But in terms of the end product, the conclusion, I think we're in agreement. We're not disagreeing.
Professor, your thesis suggests this unified motivation on the Arab side back in 1948. Is it the commonplace understanding that one of the reasons the Arabs lost was how fractured they were, and that there are these competing national interests and political interests?
Yeah, no, I didn't say that the Arabs were united in 48. It's true that the Arab states went to war on the 15th of May. They invaded the territory of Palestine. And I can talk endlessly about how they were fractured and how they had different political purposes and military purposes, which was one of the reasons they lost the war, as you point out. Jordan went to war because it didn't believe, Abdallah preferred the Jews as neighbors to Husseini as a neighbor, and he also didn't believe that he could actually destroy the Jewish enterprise. Haganah was too strong, the IDF was too strong, so the Jordanian army crossed the Jordan in order to incorporate the West Bank and East Jerusalem into the Jordanian kingdom, whereas other Arab states crossed their boundaries for other reasons, some of them to destroy Israel, some of them thinking at least to seize chunks of territory which had been assigned to the Jews for statehood by the United Nations. There was disunity. What I'm saying, I didn't say the Arab world unified around Islam in 48. Had they done that, like they did in the 12th and 13th centuries, perhaps they would have won the war. But they weren't unified. But there was a strong Islamic element in the going to war, mobilizing the masses, getting the masses to be energized for war, to fight and so on. But it doesn't mean that they were united in this effort. And as I say, the Jordanians, who were a key element in the 48 invasion and had the best army in the Middle East in the 48 war, they broke ranks and weren't interested in destroying the state of Israel, partly because they didn't believe it was possible.
What do you think will be the results? What do you think will be the results and ramifications of the Obama-Kerry peace process?
I don't think it'll go anywhere. That's the ramifications. Maybe there'll be a third intifada, maybe there'll be lots of things, but they won't reach a peace agreement.
Because?
Because on the ideological plane, as I said, I don't think the Arabs of Palestine, their elites, want to make peace with a Jewish state. They want all of Palestine for themselves. On a lower level, in terms of the strategy of negotiation and so on, there are wide gulfs between the two sides, and Israel, on that level, expanding settlements and constructing new settlements, as some of these hitnachaluyot are, aren't aiding. They're an obstacle to achieving peace. That is an obstacle in the negotiations. But as I say, even without that obstacle, they simply don't want to sign a two-state agreement. That's my view, but not everybody agrees with them.
Who's going to get one?
Can you cite other Arab leaders who proclaimed other motives for?
Oh yes, in 1948. In 1948, it's an interesting fact, incidentally. In my research, I thought it was very interesting. The Arab leaders were very pragmatic. People like Abdallah, Farouk, Kuwatli, etc., generally were pragmatic in their statements and moderate in their public statements. The Egyptians announced on the 15th of May that their army was crossing the border in order to save the Arabs of Palestine. Not even to attack the Jewish state or destroy the Jewish state, and certainly not as jihad. All they said was, we're entering the country to prevent the slaughter of the Palestinian Arabs by the Jews. That was Egypt's official statement for why it went to war on the 15th of May, made on the 15th of May. They very rarely talked, the Arab leaders, about driving the Jews into the sea. This was common in Israeli propaganda then and later, that this was the Arab aim. And maybe it was the Arab aim, or at least in the hearts of many Arabs, they may have thought this was the aim, or they may have thought, well, we'll invade Palestine and that will be the end result, even if it is not our political purpose. This is what will happen if the Jews are defeated, they will be slaughtered. But the Arab leaders in general avoided terms like throwing the Jews into the sea or destroying the Yishuv or the State of Israel. They usually avoided this completely. It's very difficult to find a quote by any of them saying that this is going to happen. There is one misquote, incidentally, a famous one by a man I talked about here called Abdul Rahman Azam, which is often trotted out and was trotted out by me mistakenly in a number of my earlier books, in which he says this will be a war of extermination like the Crusaders, like the Mongol invasion of the 13th century when they slaughtered the population of Baghdad. But it emerges, I was quoting from another book, and it emerges that he didn't make that statement in 1948. He made it months before, during 47, and not in as definitive terms as later he was quoted as doing. This is the truth about Azam's famous statement, which is always trotted out everywhere, but it's not an accurate statement, and it's always misplaced in terms of its timing, which is very important, because everybody said he said it on the 15th of May as the Arab states were invading Israel, or attacking Israel. So it wasn't made then.
So this will be the final question from Benny Weinthal of the True Simples.
Benny, do you think these Islamic movements or currents right now in the Middle East will at some point vanish and embrace modernity? And is Tunisia, for example, is that a possible model there that could undercut some of these potent Islamic movements?
I don't know. I'm not, I'm not, my wife always tells me to talk about the past, not the future. Because I know a little bit about the past, but the future I know very little. It's true that Tunisia is in the hands of moderate Islamists, and one has to remember Tunisia has a unique history. It was the most secular and modern of the Arab states, liberating themselves from Western imperialist governance. I don't know, I just don't know what will happen. But I think the more interesting case, the more important case in terms of turning the tide of Islam or Islamism is the case of Egypt. And that's the one has to watch. So Egypt is the weather vane of the Arab world. And if it's successful in suppressing the Muslim Brotherhood for a long period, that might be the model adopted in other Arab countries. If the military and the secularists fail in Egypt, that will return the Islamists to power probably in most of the Arab world.
So, Benny, on behalf of ISGAP and everybody here, thank you very much for really appreciate it. Benny was actually at the University of Miami yesterday on our behalf, and he's traveling this semester, so thank you for all the efforts you make to be here. We appreciate it. Next Monday, we have Dan Kaluni, who's giving, I think, a very important talk on sort of an academic response to the BDS movement. And then Benny Weinthal will be here on the 26th, which I believe is Thursday. Next Thursday, 5:30, the same time. Benny will be speaking about anti-Semitism in Europe, and he's really doing important work in that area. So thank you for coming. I hope to see you soon.